Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. I first noticed it on a Tuesday evening in late October. I'd been working from home for months, rarely leaving my apartment except for groceries and occasional walks. The isolation was getting to me. Zoom calls and text messages, poor substitutes for actual human contact. Maybe that's why I was more attuned to changes in my environment, more sensitive to things that didn't belong. I was making dinner, chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, when movement caught my eye. A shadow on the kitchen wall, my shadow. Except I wasn't moving. I'd paused, knife in hand, yet the silhouette continued the chopping motion for several seconds before stopping. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe headlights from a passing car creating momentary distortion. But there were no windows in my kitchen that faced the street. The next evening, I noticed it again. I was sitting on my couch reading, and on the wall opposite, my shadow turned a page several seconds after I did. I froze, book in hand, watching as the shadow continued to move slightly, adjusting its position, tilting its head as if still reading. I stood abruptly, and the shadow mimicked me, but with that same unsettling delay, rising to its feet a full 3 seconds after I did. This wasn't possible. Shadows don't move independently of their casters. They don't continue actions after you've stopped. They don't exist without a light source creating them. Yet there it was, a shadow with no apparent source, moving with a delay that made it seem like an echo of my actions, rather than a direct reflection. I did what any rational person would do. I turned on every light in the apartment, eliminating as many shadows as possible. For the rest of the evening, I avoided looking at the walls, focusing instead on my laptop screen, on the book in my hands, on anything but the dark silhouettes that might be moving when they shouldn't. Sleep came fitfully that night. Each time I drifted off, I jerked awake with the sensation of being watched. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and turned on the bedside lamp. My shadow stretched across the wall beside the bed, perfectly still as it should be. I raised my hand experimentally, watching as the shadow raised its hand in perfect synchronization. "See?" I said aloud to the empty room. "Normal shadow behavior. You're losing it, David." I lowered my hand. The shadow kept its arm raised for a full 5 seconds before slowly lowering it. I was out of bed instantly, backing toward the door, unable to take my eyes off the wall, where my shadow now stood completely still. I fumbled for the overhead light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light that eliminated most shadows. I spent the remainder of the night in my living room with every light blazing, the TV on for background noise, convincing myself that what I'd seen was a hallucination born of isolation and stress. By morning, exhausted but calmer, I decided to approach the situation methodically. First, I checked my apartment for any unusual light sources or reflective surfaces that might create optical illusions. Nothing. Next, I researched shadow phenomena online, finding nothing beyond physics explanations and a few paranormal forums with far-fetched theories about shadow people, entities that existed independently of human casters. Finally, I decided to document what was happening. If this was a psychological issue, having objective evidence might help me understand what I was experiencing. If it was something else, well, I needed proof either way. I set up my phone on a tripod in the living room, positioned to capture both me and the wall where my shadow would appear. I hit record and went about normal activities, reading, working on my laptop, making coffee. After an hour, I reviewed the footage. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The video clearly showed my shadow moving out of sync with my actions continuing, motions after I'd stopped, occasionally making small movements I hadn't made at all. At one point, while I was completely absorbed in my laptop, the shadow turned its head to look directly at the camera. I watched the footage 3 times, searching for any explanation, a glitch in the recording, a trick of the light, anything. But the evidence was undeniable. My shadow was moving independently of me. That evening, I set up multiple cameras around the apartment, recording continuously from different angles. I also began keeping a detailed log of the shadow's behavior, noting any patterns or escalations. The logs quickly revealed a progression. What had started as simple delayed mimicry was evolving. By the third day of documentation, the shadow wasn't just copying my movements with a delay. It was elaborating on them, adding flourishes, sometimes performing completely different actions while maintaining the same general position as me. When I raised my coffee mug to drink, the shadow raised what appeared to be a cup but then poured the contents over what would be its head. When I stretched after sitting too long, the shadow stretched too, but its arms extended far beyond normal human proportions, elongating until they reached the ceiling. Most disturbing was its behavior when I was still. If I sat reading or working, without moving for extended periods, the shadow would begin to move independently, pacing along the wall, examining its surroundings, sometimes appearing to watch me. The camera footage confirmed everything. This wasn't hallucination or imagination. Something impossible was happening in my apartment. After a week of documentation, I noticed another change. The shadow was becoming more defined, more three-dimensional somehow. What had started as a flat silhouette now had depth, texture, features, beginning to form within its darkness. I could sometimes make out the suggestion of eyes, not human eyes, but darker points within the darkness that seemed to track my movements. Occasionally, what might have been a mouth would appear, opening and closing as if practicing the mechanics of speech. By the 10th day, the shadow had developed a routine. It would mimic me from sunrise until approximately noon, gradually becoming more independent throughout the afternoon. By evening, it moved entirely on its own, though it still maintained my general shape and size. At night, when I tried to sleep, it would stand on the wall beside my bed watching. Sometimes I would wake to find it had moved closer, now on the ceiling directly above me, those dark points that served as eyes fixed on my face. I began to sleep with the lights on. On the morning of the 12th day, I made a discovery that changed everything. Reviewing the previous night's footage, I noticed discrepancies between what the cameras had recorded and what I remembered observing. In my memory, the shadow had paced along the wall of my bedroom for about an hour before taking up its usual watching position. But the footage showed something different. The shadow making small, precise movements almost like exercises. It would form a hand, flex what passed for fingers, then repeat the motion over and over until the movement became fluid, natural. It did the same with facial expressions, practicing smiles, frowns, looks of concern or interest. And most chillingly, it practiced my expressions, my specific gestures, the way I ran my hand through my hair when stressed or tapped my fingers when thinking. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was studying me, learning to be me. That same day, I noticed the shadow had begun to affect the physical world in small ways. When it passed over objects on a wall, a framed photo, a light switch, a thermostat, these items would momentarily malfunction. Digital displays flickered, lights dimmed, surfaces grew cold to the touch. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching shadow phenomena with renewed desperation. Most sources were useless. Ghost stories, urban legends, nothing that matched what I was experiencing. But on an obscure forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, I found a single post that made my blood run cold. It starts with mimicry, the shadow follows, then copies with delay, then moves independently. It's learning, practicing, preparing to take your place. If you're reading this and it's already started, you don't have much time. They can only cross over by replacing someone. Don't let it complete the transition. The post was from 7 years ago. The user had never posted again. I tried to contact them through the forum's messaging system, but received an automated response that the account had been deactivated. Searching for similar experiences online yielded nothing concrete, just vague stories and secondhand accounts, none with the specific progression I was witnessing. That night, I decided to confront the shadow directly. If this was some kind of entity, maybe communication was possible. Maybe there was a way to understand what it wanted, to negotiate. I sat in my living room, facing the wall where the shadow most often appeared, It was there now, mimicking my seated position but with its head tilted at an unnatural angle, those dark points fixed on me. "What are you?" I asked aloud. "What do you want from me?" The shadow remained motionless for several long seconds. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed directly at me. No, not at me. At my chest, my heart. "You wanted me?" I asked. "My body? My life?" The shadow nodded, a jerky motion that suggested it was still mastering the gesture. "Why? Where do you come from?" It made no response to these questions, just continued pointing at my chest. Then, it did something new. It pressed its hand against the wall, creating a bulge as if the surface were flexible, as if it were pushing through from the other side. I backed away instinctively. The shadow withdrew its hand, the wall returning to normal. "You can't have my life," I said firmly. "You need to go back to wherever you came from." The shadow tilted its head again, then slowly shook it from side to side. Not a refusal, I realized, but an imitation. It was copying my head shake, practicing the gesture. I decided to try an experiment. I set up additional cameras, then left my apartment for the first time in days. I needed to know what the shadow did when I wasn't present, and I needed distance to think clearly. I spent 3 hours at a nearby park, constantly fighting the urge to return and check on my apartment. When I finally did go back, everything appeared normal. The shadow was on the wall where I'd left it, now mimicking my movements again as if nothing had happened. I reviewed the footage immediately. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. For the first hour of my absence, the shadow had remained on the wall, occasionally shifting position but largely inactive. Then it began to change, stretching, expanding, becoming more three-dimensional. At the 1:37 mark, it stepped partially out of the wall, a leg and arm emerging into the physical space of my living room before withdrawing again. For the next hour, it practiced this movement, extending further into the room each time before, retreating. By the third hour, it had managed to emerge completely, a three-dimensional shadow form that moved through my apartment with increasing confidence. It went to my bedroom, opened my closet, examined my clothes. It stood before the bathroom mirror, studying its reflection, a dark, featureless silhouette with my height and build. It sat at my desk, practiced typing on my laptop, picked up and examined photographs of me with friends and family. Most disturbing of all, it practiced speaking, its mouth opening and closing silently at first, then producing visible distortions in the air as it attempted to create sound. The cameras didn't record any audible speech, but the microphones picked up strange static and low-frequency rumbles that corresponded with its mouth movements. Just before I returned home, it retreated back into the wall, becoming once again the flat shadow I was familiar with. It was preparing to replace me. The forum post had been right. That night I didn't sleep. I researched methods to eliminate shadows, not just dim them with light, but actually remove them completely. Physics told me this was impossible. A shadow is simply the absence of light, caused by an object blocking its path. But what I was dealing with wasn't a normal shadow. It wasn't my shadow at all. I tried surrounding myself with light sources from multiple angles, creating overlapping illumination that should theoretically eliminate any shadow. It worked briefly. The entity seemed confused, unable to form properly in the conflicting light. But after an hour, it adapted, appearing on the ceiling instead, where the light configuration was less effective. Next, I tried salt barriers, a desperate measure pulled from folklore about supernatural entities. I created a circle of salt around my bed, around my desk, around every space where I needed to feel safe. The shadow seemed amused, moving along the walls outside the barriers but making no attempt to cross them. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I had one more idea. If the entity was learning to exist in 3 dimensions by studying me, perhaps removing myself would prevent its transition. I would leave the apartment, stay elsewhere until I could figure out a more permanent solution. Packed quickly, throwing essentials into a backpack. As I moved toward the door, the shadow moved too, faster than I'd ever seen it move before, racing along the walls to position itself between me and the exit. There, it began to emerge again, stretching outward from the wall, taking on dimension, substance. I backed away, heart pounding. The shadow continued its emergence, a dark figure pulling itself into reality, its features becoming more defined with each passing second. I could see my own face forming in its darkness. My eyes, my nose, my mouth, but wrong somehow, like a reflection in disturbed water. It opened its mouth, and this time sound emerged, a distorted, static-filled approximation of my voice. "Stay," it said, the word barely comprehensible through the electronic interference that accompanied it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a flashlight from a drawer, and shone it directly at the entity. It recoiled, its form destabilizing momentarily, before it retreated back into the wall, becoming a shadow once more. The flashlight had hurt it somehow. Direct, focused light affected it more than ambient illumination. I had a weapon, however temporary. I made it out of the apartment, flashlight in hand, constantly sweeping its beam across any shadows that seemed to move. Outside, in the bright morning sunlight, I felt safer, but I knew it wouldn't last. Night would come eventually. I checked into a motel on the other side of town, a cheap place with harsh fluorescent lighting and minimal decoration, fewer surfaces for shadows to gather. I purchased additional flashlights, UV lamps, anything that produced strong directed light. For 3 days I stayed in that motel room, lights blazing 24/7, researching everything I could find about shadow entities. Most sources were useless New Age speculation or horror fiction, but occasionally I found accounts that matched aspects of my experience. Shadows that moved independently, that studied their human counterparts, that gradually became more substantial. None of the accounts included a resolution. They simply ended, often abruptly. On the 4th day, I received a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Kravitz. She was concerned because she'd seen me entering my apartment the previous evening, but I hadn't responded. When she knocked to deliver a package that had been left in the building's lobby, "That wasn't me," I said, my mouth dry with fear. "I haven't been home in days." There was a long pause before she responded. "Well, someone who looks exactly like you went into your apartment last night, wearing that blue jacket you always wear." He even waved to me. After assuring her I was fine and making up a story about my cousin staying at my place, I hung up and sat in stunned silence. It had happened. The entity had completed its transition. It had taken physical form, my form, and was now living in my apartment, assuming my identity. I had to go back. I had to confront it, to reclaim my life before it completely took over. I armed myself with the strongest flashlights I could find, a UV lamp strapped to my belt, and returned to my building that evening. Mrs. Kravitz was in the lobby when I entered. She looked at me with confusion. "I just saw you go upstairs not 5 minutes ago," she said. I mumbled something about hurrying to catch up with my cousin and took the stairs 2 at a time. Outside my apartment, I hesitated, key in hand. What would I find inside? What would happen when I confronted an entity that had stolen my appearance, my identity? I entered quietly, flashlight ready. The apartment was dark except for the blue glow of my laptop screen. Sitting at my desk, illuminated by that light, was me. A perfect duplicate, down to the small scar on my right hand from a childhood accident. It turned as I entered, and I saw my own face looking back at me. But the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, like holes leading to somewhere else. "You've returned," it said in my voice, the sound no longer distorted. I didn't expect that. "This is my home," I said, aiming the flashlight, but not turning it on yet. "My life. You can't have it." It smiled, my smile, but with something else behind it. "But I already do have it. Your neighbor recognizes me. Your co-workers accepted the emails I sent from your account. Your friends responded to my texts without suspicion." It gestured to the laptop. "I've been learning you for weeks. Your patterns, your relationships, your history. I am you now, in all the ways that matter to this world." "What happens to me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "You'll transition to my side," it said simply. Where I came from, the shadow place. It's a fair exchange. And if I refuse, it shrugged. My shrug, perfectly executed. Then we exist as duplicates until one of us is removed. Society doesn't accommodate duplicates well. Who do you think they'll believe is the real David? The one with the apartment, the job, the established presence? Or the one who appeared suddenly with a wild story about shadow entities? It was right. If I called the police, sought help from friends, tried to reclaim my identity, who would believe me? The entity had perfectly positioned itself in my life while I had been hiding in a motel, absent from work, unreachable by friends. I raised the flashlight and turned it on, aiming the beam directly at its face. It flinched slightly but didn't recoil as it had before. "That won't work anymore," it said. "I'm fully transitioned now, physical, real." It stood and took a step toward me. "But you're not. Look at your hands, David." I glanced down and felt a surge of horror. My hands were losing definition, the edges blurring, becoming slightly translucent. I could see the floor through them. "The transition works both ways," the entity explained. "As I become more solid here, you become less so. Eventually, you'll be as I was. A shadow, a watcher from the walls. It's already beginning." I backed toward the door, but it moved with surprising speed, blocking my exit. "You can't leave," it said. "The transition must complete. If you die in this half-state, neither of us will fully exist in either world." I looked around desperately for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My gaze fell on the UV lamp at my belt. If direct light had hurt it before, I unclipped the lamp and switched it on, creating a flood of ultraviolet light. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The entity hissed in pain, its stolen form wavering like a mirage in desert heat. But more surprising was the effect on me. My blurring hands became more solid, more defined in the UV glow. The transition wasn't one way. It could be reversed. I advanced. UV lamp extended. The entity retreated, its features distorting, my face melting into the featureless shadow it had once been. Where the UV light touched it directly, its substance seemed to evaporate like mist. "You don't understand," it gasped, its voice distorting back to that static-filled approximation. "I was chosen, sent. There are others like me, watching, waiting, for their chance. You can't stop the transition." "Watch me," I said and lunged forward, pressing the UV lamp directly against its chest. What happened next defies easy description. The entity seemed to implode, its stolen form collapsing inward, like a black hole, pulling at the fabric of reality around it. I felt a tugging sensation, as if part of me were being drawn into that collapsing point. Then came a flash of impossible darkness, darker than the absence of light, a negative radiance that burned in its intensity. When my vision cleared, the entity was gone. In its place was a shadow on the wall, flat, ordinary, moving only when I moved. My shadow. Just a shadow. I spent the next several days testing, making sure the entity was truly gone. My shadow behaved normally, moving in perfect synchronization with me. No delayed mimicry, no independent movement. The cameras recorded nothing unusual. By all appearances, things had returned to normal. But I know better. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I catch a flicker of movement on a wall where no shadow should be. Sometimes, reviewing security footage, I notice distortions in my own recorded shadow. Subtle movements out of sync with my actions, quickly corrected as if catching a mistake. And sometimes, in reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, the black screen of my phone before it lights up, I see a face looking back at me that is almost but not quite my own. The eyes too dark, the smile slightly wrong. I keep UV lamps in every room now. I sleep with them on, creating a protective bubble of light that keeps my shadow firmly attached to me, preventing it from learning, practicing, preparing for another attempt. Because the entity was right about one thing. There are others like it, watching from the walls, from the dark corners, from the shadows we all cast without thinking. learning our movements, our expressions, our lives, preparing to take our places. Look at your shadow sometime. Watch it carefully. Does it move exactly when you move, or is there a delay? Does it continue a motion after you've stopped? Does it ever, when you're very still and the light is just right, seem to be watching you? And if it is, remember, direct light hurts them. UV light reverses the transition, and most importantly, never let them complete the replacement. Because once they've taken your place, your life, your identity, there's no way back from the shadow world. You become the watcher on the wall, waiting for your chance to return, to reclaim what was taken from you. I stopped my shadow from replacing me, but I can feel it waiting, learning from its failure, growing stronger in the darkness, and it's not alone. The call came at 3:17 a.m. I remember checking the time as I fumbled for my phone, that familiar hour when the veil between worlds feels thinnest. Mia, it's about Dad. My brother Alex's voice was hollow, mechanical. He's gone. Suicide. I sat, up in bed, fully alert, a chill settling over me despite the warm June night. How? Hanged himself in the attic. Left a note that just said I couldn't keep them away anymore. Those words triggered an immediate visceral reaction, a tightening in my chest, a prickling sensation at the base of my skull. The same feeling I'd had during those terrifying episodes, as a child when I'd wake unable to move, sensing a presence in my room. "I'm booking a flight home," I said. "We all are," Alex replied. "Even Daniel." That surprised me. Our youngest brother hadn't spoken to Dad in nearly a decade, not since he'd fled to California, claiming he couldn't spend another night in that house. 3 days later, the three of us stood in the driveway of our childhood home in rural Massachusetts. The Victorian farmhouse looked exactly as I remembered, imposing with its weather-beaten clapboards and too many windows, like a face with too many eyes. Daniel stared up at the attic window, his face pale. "I told him to leave this place." "Couldn't," Alex said. "You know that." I did know. Dad had explained it once when I was 16 after finding me frozen in sleep paralysis for the third night that week. "The Blackwoods have always lived here," he'd said. "And the Blackwoods have always had troubled sleep. It's our burden to bear." Inside, the house smelled of old books and the faint chemical tang of Dad's medications. As a psychiatrist specializing in sleep disorders, he'd self-prescribed various treatments over the years, all failing to keep the nocturnal visitors at bay. We gathered in his study, surrounded by medical texts and journals filled with his meticulous handwriting. Alex, now a neurologist, immediately gravitated toward Dad's research notes. "He was getting worse," Alex murmured, flipping through a leather-bound journal. "Listen to this. Night 317. They're no longer confined to paralysis episodes. Saw the tall one standing by the bookshelf while fully awake. The medication isn't working. Nothing works." Daniel paced nervously. "We need to sell this place, clear out his things, and never come back. We can't just ignore what happened," I argued. "Dad was brilliant if he couldn't find a way out." "Out of what?" Daniel snapped. "Out of a genetic predisposition to sleep disorders? Out of the family madness?" Alex looked up sharply. "It's not madness. The paralysis is real. The hypnagogic hallucinations are real. We've all experienced them." "Some more than others," I said quietly, glancing at Daniel. His episodes had been the most severe, often leaving him screaming when he finally broke free of the paralysis. That night, we each chose our old bedrooms, despite Daniel's protests. I lay awake for hours, dreading the familiar sensation that had plagued my childhood. The sudden inability to move, the pressure on my chest, the shadowy figure that always stood in the same corner, watching. When it finally came, it was worse than I remembered. The paralysis gripped me like concrete setting around my limbs. The shadow in the corner was more defined than ever, tall and thin with elongated fingers and what appeared to be a hood covering where its face should be. "The last Blackwoods have returned," a voice whispered directly into my mind. "The circle closes." When I could move again, I ran to Alex's room, finding him sitting up in bed, shaking. You saw them too, he said. It wasn't a question. Daniel burst in moments later, his face streaked with tears. We're getting out of here now. No, Alex said firmly. Dad was close to something, I can feel it. The next morning, fueled by too much coffee and lingering fear, we began a systematic search of Dad's research. His study contained decades of notes on sleep disorders, particularly focused on familial patterns of sleep paralysis. Behind his desk, we discovered a hidden panel leading to a small room we'd never known existed. Inside was an archive of family history dating back centuries, journals, medical records, and genealogical charts, all focused on the same phenomenon: Blackwoods and their night terrors. Look at this, Alex said, carefully unfolding a yellowed document. It's a trial transcript from 1692. The document detailed the arrest of Prudence Blackwood during the Salem witch trials. Unlike most accused, she wasn't executed. Instead, the transcript referenced a special arrangement with authorities, allowing her and her descendants to live under observation. They thought our family was special somehow, I murmured. Daniel found a more recent file, a research proposal dated 1953 from something called the Somnus Institute. It referenced Project Cassandra and predictive sleep states in genetically predisposed subjects. As we dug deeper, a disturbing picture emerged. Our family hadn't just suffered from sleep paralysis, we'd been studied for generations. The Somnus Institute, a shadowy research organization dating back to the early 18th century, had monitored the Blackwood line, believing our paralysis episodes weren't just hallucinations, but glimpses into future events. Dad's most recent journals confirmed he'd discovered the truth. Our visitors during paralysis weren't random hallucinations, but actual entities. Researchers from the Somnus Institute using experimental technology to enter our consciousness during vulnerable sleep states. They've been using us as predictive oracles, Alex said, his voice shaking. They believe our family can see fragments of future events during paralysis. That's insane, Daniel protested. I wasn't so sure. Remember when I saw that bridge collapse? During an episode? 3 weeks later, the Westfield Bridge failed exactly as I'd seen it. Alex nodded. And I saw that hospital fire before it happened. Daniel's face paled. The school shooting. I described it to Dad weeks before. We found Dad's final research breakthrough in a hidden compartment of his desk, a genetic analysis showing a unique mutation in the Blackwood DNA, affecting how our brains process temporal information during specific sleep phases. The mutation dated back to our medieval ancestors and had strengthened through generations of selective breeding. They arranged marriages, Alex said in disgust, showing us correspondence between the Institute and various family friends who had encouraged relationships with specific partners. We've been their lab rats, Daniel whispered. Dad's suicide note suddenly made terrible sense. His last journal entry revealed he'd discovered the Institute's ultimate plan, to use his children's heightened abilities for a project called Temporal Aperture, an attempt to not just glimpse but potentially alter future events. That night, none of us wanted to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won. My paralysis came swiftly, but this time I was prepared, focusing my consciousness despite my immobile body. The hooded figure appeared as expected, but I mentally pushed back against its presence. Who are you? I demanded without speaking. Sense of surprise emanated from the entity. You've never been aware during contact before. I know what you're doing, I projected. Using our family, manipulating our genetics. The figure moved closer. Your father discovered too much. We offered him partnership, but he refused. Partnership in what? Preventing catastrophe. Your bloodline sees what's coming. We need that sight. Images flooded my mind. Climate collapse, war, a darkness spreading across continents, future events. But how distant I couldn't tell. When I broke free from the paralysis, I found Alex and Daniel already in the hallway, their expressions confirming they'd had similar experiences. They showed me what's coming, Daniel said, his voice small. It's why they've been watching us. Over the following days, we pieced together the full truth. The Somnus Institute had been founded by forward-thinking scientists who discovered certain bloodlines could perceive temporal anomalies during sleep paralysis. The Blackwoods were their most successful subjects, our genetic mutation allowing us to glimpse potential futures with remarkable accuracy. Dad had discovered that the Institute wasn't just observing anymore. They'd developed technology to enhance and direct our visions, essentially using our minds as predictive algorithms for global threats. His notes suggested they'd been influencing world events based on Blackwood predictions for decades. He killed himself because he saw something they're planning, Alex concluded. Something he couldn't stop. In Dad's final encrypted journal, we found coordinates to a Somnus facility and access codes he'd somehow obtained. We debated what to do with this information. Expose them, confront them, or run as far as possible. The decision was made for us when we each experienced the same vision during our next paralysis episode, a clear image of the three of us entering the facility, accessing their central database and discovering the truth about Project Cassandra. It's not just about seeing the future, I realized. If multiple futures exist, and we can see them, we can choose which one becomes reality, Daniel finished. The entities visit us every night now, no longer hiding their purpose. They're preparing us for what comes next, teaching us to control the paralysis, to direct our visions toward specific temporal coordinates. We've learned our family isn't cursed but gifted. The question remains whether this gift will save humanity or enslave it. The Somnus Institute believes they're preventing catastrophe, but Dad discovered they've been selectively implementing futures that benefit their own interests. Tomorrow, we leave for the coordinates in Dad's journal. We don't know if we're walking into a trap or a revelation, but as the last Blackwoods, we have a responsibility to understand the power in our blood, and to ensure it's used to glimpse the best possible future, not just for us, but for everyone. The entities will follow us, of course, they always do. But for the first time in generations, the Blackwoods are awake and aware, and ready to reclaim our stolen dreams. I never believed in the supernatural, not really. I was raised on science and skepticism, taught to question extraordinary claims and seek rational explanations. Ghost stories were just that, stories. Urban legends were psychological curiosities, nothing more. Then I died. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, the semi-truck driver never saw my car in his blind spot during the lane change. The impact sent my vehicle spinning across 3 lanes of highway traffic before it slammed into the concrete divider. The airbags deployed, but at those speeds they could only do so much. I don't remember the crash itself, just a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, a deafening crunch of metal, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital, my body a symphony of pain, my sister Emily clutching my hand with tear-stained cheeks. "Marcus," she sobbed when she saw my eyes open. "Thank God. We thought we'd lost you." According to the doctors, they had lost me briefly. My heart had stopped in the ambulance. No pulse for 3 minutes and 42 seconds before they managed to resuscitate me. A temporary death, they called it, as if that somehow made it less significant. I had no memory of those minutes. No white light, no deceased relatives welcoming me. No life review. Just a gap in my existence. A brief cessation of being. I found this oddly disappointing. Even as a skeptic, I had hoped that if I ever did have a near-death experience, I might glimpse something profound. Be careful what you wish for. The physical recovery was slow but straightforward. A broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, a concussion, and enough cuts and bruises to make me look like I'd gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight. The doctors were optimistic. I was young, healthy, and had received prompt medical attention. In time, my body would heal completely. They didn't mention the other effects. How could they? There's no medical test for what happened to me, no scan, that could have detected the door that had been opened. It began 3 weeks after the accident, my first night back in my own apartment. Emily had been staying with me since my discharge from the hospital, sleeping on my couch, helping with everything from medication management to meal preparation. But she had a life to return to, a job, a fiancé, responsibilities that couldn't be put on hold indefinitely. We both agreed I was well enough to manage on my own. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension as I closed and locked the door behind her that evening. Relief at having my space to myself again, apprehension at the thought of navigating my recovery alone. I took my evening pain medication, watched mindless television for a few hours, and finally dragged myself to bed around midnight. The sleep paralysis hit sometime in the early morning hours. I'd experienced it once or twice before in my life, usually during periods of high stress or irregular sleep patterns, so I recognized the sensation immediately. The crushing weight on my chest, the complete inability to move, the sense of a malevolent presence in the room. What I didn't recognize was him. He stood in the corner of my bedroom, a silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness. Tall, impossibly tall, his head nearly touching my 8-foot ceiling. Broad-shouldered, but thin, with unnaturally long arms that hung motionless at his sides. And the hat, a wide-brimmed fedora or something similar, giving his head a distinctive profile that somehow made the featureless shadow even more menacing. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only stare at the figure as my heart hammered against my ribs and sweat soaked through my t-shirt. The entity remained perfectly still, facing me, though I could discern no eyes in the inky blackness where a face should have been. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes before the paralysis began to lift. As soon as I could, move my fingers, then my hand, then my arm, the figure faded, dissolving into the ordinary shadows of my bedroom. I sat up gasping, fumbling for the lamp on my nightstand. Light flooded the room, revealing nothing unusual. No intruder, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Sleep paralysis, I said aloud, my voice shaky but determined. Hypnagogic hallucination triggered by trauma and medication. Textbook case. I repeated this explanation to myself as I got up to check that my apartment door was still locked. It was. As I checked each room and closet for intruders, none, and as I made myself a cup of tea with trembling hands. By the time dawn broke, I had almost convinced myself. Almost. The second visitation came 2 nights later. Same circumstances. Waking in the early morning hours, unable to move, aware of a presence in the room. But this time, the Hat Man wasn't. In the corner. He stood at the foot of my bed, still the same impossible height, the same featureless shadow face beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Still completely motionless, but closer now, close enough that if he reached out with one of those unnaturally long arms, he might touch me. He didn't. He simply stood there, watching. Though how I knew he was watching when I could see no eyes, I couldn't say. There was simply an unmistakable sense of focused attention, of being observed with terrible intensity. When the paralysis lifted and I could move again, he faded as before. I turned on every light in the apartment and didn't sleep again that night. The next day I called my doctor and explained what was happening, carefully framing it in clinical terms: sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, possible side effects of my pain medication. He was sympathetic but unconcerned, explaining that such experiences were not uncommon following traumatic events and significant medication regimens. "Your brain is processing a lot right now," he said. "The accident, the pain, the medications. It's no wonder you're experiencing sleep disturbances. If it continues or worsens, we can consider adjusting your medication or referring you to a sleep specialist." I accepted this explanation eagerly, clinging to its rationality like a life preserver in choppy waters. That night, I reduced my pain, medication slightly, against medical advice, but I was desperate, and left my bedside lamp on when I went to sleep. It made no difference. The Hat Man came again, standing now at the side of my bed, close enough that the edge of his shadow form seemed to merge with the sheets. I lay paralyzed, staring up at the looming figure, noticing new details in my terror. How the darkness that composed him seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than being illuminated by it. How there seemed to be subtle movements within the blackness, like smoke or liquid shifting beneath the surface. When I could move again and he had faded, I didn't bother checking the apartment. Instead, I opened my laptop with shaking hands and typed "tall shadow figure hat sleep paralysis" into the search bar. The results stunned me. Thousands of hits. Thousands of people describing exactly what I had seen. A tall shadow figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, appearing during episodes of sleep paralysis. They called it the Hat Man, and reports of sightings spanned cultures, continents, and decades. I spent the rest of the night reading account after account, each one chillingly similar to my experience. The impossible height, the featureless face, the distinctive hat, the sense of being watched with malevolent intent, and most disturbing of all, the pattern many reported. The Hat Man appearing first in the corner of the room, then moving closer with each visitation, just as he had done with me. Some accounts described him as a sleep paralysis hallucination, nothing more. Others attributed religious or supernatural significance to him, a demon, a harbinger of death, an interdimensional being. A few even claimed he was an alien entity studying human subjects. I found myself drawn to a forum dedicated specifically to Hatman experiences. The members there had moved beyond theorizing about what he was and focused instead on documenting patterns in his appearances and developing coping strategies. I created an account under the username New Observer and posted my experiences, describing the accident, the resuscitation, and the 3 visitations. The responses came quickly. Hatwatcher 17. Welcome to the group, though I'm sorry for the circumstances. Your experience fits the pattern we've been documenting. Did you have a near-death experience before the visitations began? I replied. Yes, my heart stopped for over 3 minutes after a car accident. Shadow Seer. That tracks. About 68% of our members report NDE or close brushes with death before their first Hatman sighting. We think it creates some kind of connection or opening. Vigilant too. How close has he gotten? Has he tried to touch you yet? The question sent a chill through me. I typed, no, he just stands there. Started in the corner, then moved to the foot of my bed, then the side. He doesn't move during the episodes. Hatwatcher 17. That's the typical progression. He'll likely continue to get closer. Whatever you do, don't let him touch you. I stared at those words, a cold weight settling in my stomach. What happens if he touches you? There was a long pause before the replies came. Shadow Seer. We've lost contact with every member who reported being touched. Vigilant. 3 members who said the Hatman was close enough to touch them were found dead the next day. Official causes, heart failure, stroke, and unknown causes. No signs of foul play, but Hatwatcher 17. We believe he's trying to cross over fully into our reality. The NDEs create a bridge, but he needs direct contact to complete the transition. That's our working theory anyway. I closed my laptop, my mind reeling. This was madness. These people were feeding each other's delusions, creating a shared mythology around what was clearly a neurological phenomenon. Sleep paralysis was well documented in medical literature. The consistency of the Hatman appearance across different experiencers could be explained by cultural contamination, the power of suggestion, perhaps even some shared archetype in the human subconscious. That's what the rational part of my brain insisted. But another part, a part that had grown stronger since those 3 minutes and 42 seconds of non-existence, whispered that there might be more to it, that the door between life and death, once opened, might not close completely. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I tried everything, sleeping with lights on, sleeping in different rooms, even having Emily come stay with me again. Nothing helped. The Hatman came each night, standing progressively closer to my bedside. By the 5th night, he stood directly beside me, his featureless face bent over mine, close enough that if he had breath, I would have felt it on my skin. The 6th night, one long, shadowy arm was extended, reaching toward me. The fingers, too many fingers, each one unnaturally thin and elongated, hovering inches above my chest. I returned to the forum, desperate for help. The members offered various strategies: protective crystals, prayers from different religious traditions, sleeping with mirrors facing away from the bed. Apparently, the Hat Man avoided his own reflection. Even elaborate rituals involving salt, circles, and specific incantations. I tried them all, my former skepticism crumbling under the weight of nightly terror. Nothing worked. The Hat Man continued his inexorable approach. After 2 weeks of this, I was a wreck, sleep-deprived, jumpy, losing weight, unable to focus on my recovery or anything else. Emily was worried sick, threatening to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for my own good. My doctor had prescribed sleeping pills and referred me to a psychiatrist, who nodded sympathetically as I carefully edited my experiences into something that wouldn't sound completely delusional. Then I received a private message on the forum from a user named Survivor56. "I've been following your posts. I think I can help. I'm the only person I know of who was touched by the Hat Man and lived to tell about it. Can we talk?" We arranged a video call for that afternoon. I wasn't sure what to expect. Perhaps a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist or a New Age guru trying to sell me protective talismans. What I saw instead was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a calm demeanor, sitting in what looked like an ordinary living room. "My name is Diana," she said without preamble. "I experienced the Hat Man for 3 weeks following a near-drowning incident 4 years ago. On the final night, he touched me." "What happened?" I asked, leaning toward my screen. It was like being submerged in ice water. I felt him, not just his finger on my chest, but his presence flowing into me, trying to displace me. Like he was trying to wear my body like a suit. She shuddered at the memory. I fought. With everything I had, I fought to stay present, to stay me. Most people can't. They get overwhelmed, pushed out or aside, and the body fails when the consciousness is displaced. "How did you fight it?" "I had an anchor," she said. Something the Hat Man couldn't understand or replicate. For me, it was my daughter's laugh. The specific way she giggles when I tickle her in just the right spot under her arm. I held on to that sound, that memory with everything I had. It was something uniquely mine, something he couldn't access or override. "And it worked?" I asked, desperate for any solution. "I'm here, aren't I?" She leaned closer to the camera. "The Hat Man is a parasite, Marcus. He needs hosts to fully manifest in our reality. Your near-death experience created a connection, a door he can approach through but can't fully pass without direct contact. You need to find your anchor before he touches you." "My anchor," I repeated. "Something uniquely mine. Something tied to your deepest sense of self. Something emotionally significant that can't be replicated or simulated. A memory, a sensation, a relationship, something that defines you." I thought about it for the rest of the day, searching my memories and experiences for something that might serve as this anchor. I had lived a relatively ordinary life before the accident. Good family, decent education, satisfying if unexciting. Career as a graphic designer. What defined me? What was uniquely mine? As evening approached, bringing with it the dread of another night, another visitation, I found myself looking through old photos on my phone. There was one from a camping trip with my father when I was 12. The last trip we took before cancer. Took him the following year. In the photo, we're sitting side by side on a fallen log, fishing rods in hand, laughing at some forgotten joke. I remember the moment with perfect clarity. The smell of the pine trees, the cool mist rising from the lake, the particular timbre of my father's laugh. That laugh. It had been 16 years since I'd heard it, but I could recall it perfectly. A deep rumbling sound that seemed to start in his belly and work its way up, genuine and uninhibited. Could that be my anchor? Not just the memory of the sound, but the feeling it evoked. Safety, connection, being truly seen and loved. I had no way of knowing if it would work, but as night fell and I prepared for bed, it was the best hope I had. The Hat Man came as expected, materializing first in the corner, then suddenly standing beside my bed. The paralysis gripped me immediately, more intense than ever before. He leaned over me, his featureless face inches from mine, One arm extended, those two long fingers reaching for my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But in my mind, I summoned my father's laugh, that specific, beloved sound. I held it in my consciousness, let it fill me completely, focusing on it with every ounce of my being. The shadow fingers touched my chest. Cold beyond imagining flooded through me, a freezing darkness that seemed to seep into every cell. I felt a pressure in my mind, an alien presence pushing against my consciousness, seeking entry, seeking control. I clung to the memory of my father's laugh, wrapped myself in it like armor. The pressure increased, the cold intensified, and for a moment I felt myself slipping, my sense of self beginning to fragment. Then something unexpected happened. As I focused on my father's laugh, other memories surfaced. Emily teaching me to ride a bike, my mother's hands guiding mine as I learned to draw, my first kiss, my college graduation. The tapestry of experiences and connections that made me who I was. And I realized my anchor wasn't just one memory, one connection. It was all of them. It was the web of relationships and experiences that defined me, that made me uniquely myself. I gathered these memories around me like a shield, and something changed in the quality of the darkness pressing against me. There was a sense of confusion, then frustration, then something like fear. The cold began to recede. The pressure in my mind eased. The Hat Man's form seemed less solid, the edges of his shadow body wavering like smoke in a breeze. He withdrew, his hand from my chest, and straightened to his full height. The featureless face still turned toward me. For a moment we regarded each other, me paralyzed on the bed, him towering beside it, both of us aware that something unprecedented had occurred. Then, with a motion that seemed almost like a nod, an acknowledgement, he stepped back and faded into the ordinary shadows of my bedroom. The paralysis lifted and I sat up gasping, my heart pounding but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the Hat Man would not return, at least not for me. Whatever test or battle had just occurred, I had passed or won. The next day I returned to the forum and shared my experience. The responses were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and desperate hope from those still experiencing visitations. I connected with Diana again, comparing notes on our experiences and what had worked for us. Over the following weeks, we identified 5 other forum members who had successfully repelled the Hat Man's touch. A pattern emerged. Each had found their own version of an anchor, something deeply connected to their sense of self and human connection. We formed a support group of sorts, reaching out to new members reporting Hat Man sightings following near-death experiences, sharing what we had learned. Some listened and found their anchors in time. Others dismissed our advice as superstition or were too afraid to share their experiences until it was too late. Their forum accounts going suddenly silent, news of unexplained deaths occasionally filtering back to us through mutual connections. It's been 2 years since my accident, since those 3 minutes and 42 seconds of non-existence that opened a door. My physical injuries have healed completely, leaving only a few scars as reminders. The psychological impact has been more complex. I no longer consider myself a skeptic, but neither have I embraced any particular supernatural belief system. I exist in a middle ground of knowing, aware that there are aspects of reality beyond our conventional understanding, yet wary of those who claim to have all the answers. The Hat Man hasn't returned to me, but I know he's still out there, approaching. Others who have briefly touched death and returned. Our support group continues to grow, both with survivors like me and new experiencers seeking help. We don't have all the answers, but we have enough to help some people survive the visitations. What is the Hat Man? We still don't know with certainty. An interdimensional parasite? A psychopomp that sometimes fails to complete its task? A manifestation of death itself, trying to reclaim those who escaped its grasp? The theories are endless. What we do know is this. Near-death experiences can create openings, connections to whatever realm or dimension this entity inhabits. It uses these connections to approach our reality, appearing first as a shadow, then attempting to fully cross over through direct contact with the person who created the bridge. And we know that the thing that stops it, the force it cannot overcome, is the complex web of human connection and personal identity that defines each of us. Our anchors are not physical objects or magical incantations. They are the unique patterns of our lives and loves, the relationships and experiences that make us who we are. Sometimes, late at night when I'm on the edge of sleep, I think I glimpse movement in the dark corners of my room. Not the Hat Man himself, but perhaps the edge of his realm, the threshold between our reality and whatever exists beyond. In those moments, I don't feel fear. Instead, I feel a strange sort of gratitude. My brief death and the terror that followed forced me to identify what truly matters in my life, what truly defines me. It connected me with others who have touched death and returned, creating a community of understanding that transcends ordinary experience. And it reminded me that whatever exists beyond this life, whatever waits on the other side of that door, it is not the absence of existence, but perhaps another form of it, one that interacts with ours in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Hat Man taught me that death is not the end of the story. Whether that's a comfort or a new kind of terror, depends, I suppose, on who you are and what anchors you to this world. I still sleep with a light on, though. Some habits are hard to break. The first knock came at exactly midnight. 3 sharp raps evenly spaced, precise as a metronome. Sarah Winters paused Netflix and listened, wondering who would visit at such an hour in the small town of Millfield, where most businesses closed. By 8 and streets emptied soon after. The knocking repeated, still exactly 3 raps. Reluctantly, she approached her front door, peering through the peephole. A tall figure stood on her porch, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned, dark suit. The porch light cast strange shadows across features that seemed somehow wrong. Too angular, too deep-set. But he looked official, holding what appeared to be a clipboard or tablet. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "Census Bureau," replied a voice that sounded like paper rustling. "Annual supplementary data collection." Sarah frowned. "At midnight? And the census is every 10 years, not annual." A pause. "Special demographic study. Regional office authorization. I can show credentials." Something felt off, but Sarah had always been practical. The visitor hadn't tried the door handle, hadn't behaved threateningly, and she was curious. She opened the door, keeping the chain latched. The man on her porch was impossibly tall, at least 6'6", rail-thin with skin so pale it seemed to absorb the porch light rather than reflect it. His suit was indeed old-fashioned, something from the 1940s perhaps, with high lapels and a watch chain. His clipboard was ancient, wooden with metal clamps, but most disturbing were his eyes, dark hollows that seemed to recede into his skull, revealing nothing but shadow. "Good evening, Ms. Winters," he said, consulting his clipboard. "I have just a few questions for the midnight census." "There's no such thing as a midnight census," Sarah said, suddenly cold despite the warm June night. "And how do you know my name?" The figure's head tilted slightly, an oddly mechanical movement. "It's on my list. All residents are on my list." He raised his clipboard. "May I begin?" Against her better judgment, Sarah nodded, keeping the chain firmly in place. "What is your greatest fear, Ms. Winters?" the figure asked, pen poised above his form. The question was so unexpected that Sarah almost answered truthfully. Her fear of drowning, ever since a childhood incident at Lake Millfield. But something stopped her. "I don't fear anything," she lied. "And that's not a census question." The figure's pen paused. Those shadowed eyes seemed to deepen. "Interesting. Question 2. What do you dream about most frequently?" Again, Sarah almost answered with the truth. Her recurring dream of flying over Millfield, seeing the town from above. Again, she caught herself. "I don't remember my dreams," she lied. "Who did you say you work for again?" The figure made a notation. "Final question. What do you believe happens after death?" This time, Sarah didn't even consider answering. "I think you should leave now. I'm calling the police." The figure studied her for a long moment, then made a final notation. "Thank you for your participation, Ms. Winters. Your responses have been recorded." He tipped an old-fashioned hat she hadn't noticed before. "Sleep well." He turned and walked away, his movements too smooth, his legs seeming slightly too long. Sarah quickly closed and locked her door, then called the police. Officer Ray Delgado arrived 20 minutes later, looking tired but concerned. He took her statement, nodding occasionally. "You're the third call tonight," he said finally. "All after midnight, all describing the same visitor, asking bizarre questions." "Who is he?" Sarah asked. Delgado shrugged. "No idea. We haven't been able to locate him, but I'll have a car drive by your house periodically tonight." After he left, Sarah tried to return to her show but couldn't focus. The visitor's questions lingered in her mind. What was her greatest fear? Drowning, yes, but more deeply. It was the fear of being forgotten after she died, of leaving no mark on the world. What did she dream about? Flying, but also about reconnecting with her estranged sister. What happened after death she had no idea, and that uncertainty terrified her. She had almost told a complete stranger her deepest vulnerabilities. Sleep came fitfully, and when she woke the next morning, Sarah immediately checked her phone. 3 missed calls from her neighbor, Elaine, and a text. "Call me ASAP," Elaine answered on the first ring. "Have you heard about Tom Grayson?" Tom lived 2 streets over, a retired accountant who walked his golden retriever past Sarah's house every morning. "What about him?" Sarah asked. "He's dead. Found this morning in his living room. Heart attack, they're saying, but..." Elaine lowered her voice. "Lisa from the pharmacy said the paramedics found him with the strangest expression, like he'd seen something impossible." A chill ran through Sarah. "Elaine, did Tom have a visitor last night? Someone claiming to be from the census?" "How did you know?" "Yes, around midnight. Tom mentioned it when I called him about our garden club meeting. Said some government man was asking the oddest questions. Tom's always been so proper. Said he answered everything truthfully because it's our civic duty." Elaine paused. "Sarah, what's going on?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I had the same visitor. So did others, according to the police." By afternoon, the news had spread through Millfield's population of 8,742. 4 people had died overnight. Tom Grayson, elderly Mrs. Abernathy from Church Street, middle-aged physics teacher Robert Kwan, and 26-year-old Jenny Larson, who worked at the Dairy Queen. All had received midnight visits. All had been found dead the next morning, apparently from natural causes: heart attacks, strokes, 1 aneurysm. All with expressions of profound terror. Sarah called Officer Delgado, who sounded harried. "We're aware of the situation, Ms. Winters. The state police have been notified. Please stay inside tonight and don't open your door to anyone." That evening, Sarah invited Elaine over. Neither wanted to be alone, and Elaine had brought something interesting: her grandfather's journal from 1923. "I remembered something," Elaine explained, carefully turning brittle pages. "Grandpa used to tell stories about the Midnight Man who came to Millfield when he was a boy. I thought it was just a scary story, but look at this." The journal entry was dated June 17, 1923. "Another death this morning. Frederick Miller found dead in his armchair, eyes wide open. That makes 7 since the Midnight Man began his rounds. Mayor Holbrook finally telegraphed the state authorities, but I fear it's too late. Those who answer his questions truthfully are found dead. Those who refuse or lie report seeing shadows watching them afterward. I lied when he came to our door. Now I see movement in every corner, figures that vanish when I turn to look directly at them. Mary thinks I'm going mad." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "Today is June 17th, Elaine nodded grimly. Exactly 100 years later. They spent the evening researching, pulling town records from the internet and calling older residents. By nightfall, they had assembled a disturbing picture. In June 1923, a census taker named Edmund Thorne had arrived in Millfield to conduct a special demographic study. Witnesses described him as unusually tall and formal. For 2 weeks, he visited Homes at midnight asking strange personal questions. Those who answered truthfully died in their sleep. Those who refused or lied reported being watched by shadow figures. On June 30th, Edmund Thorne disappeared without a trace, and the deaths stopped. The shadow sightings continued for months afterward before gradually fading. But why is it happening again now, exactly a century later? Sarah wondered. Elaine had found something else. A newspaper clipping from 1923 mentioning that before becoming a census taker, Edmund Thorne had been an anthropologist specializing in folklore about entities that fed on human consciousness. He believed certain information, fears, dreams, beliefs about death, contained psychic energy that these entities could consume, Elaine read. His colleagues dismissed his theories as superstition. So what? He made some kind of deal with these entities? Sarah asked skeptically. Collect human fears in exchange for what? Knowledge? Power? Immortality? Elaine suggested. The legends all say he vanished, not that he died. At 11:45 p.m., they locked all doors and windows, drew the curtains, and sat in Sarah's living room, lights on, waiting. Sarah had called Officer Delgado again, who promised to park outside her house at midnight. At exactly 12 a.m., 3 sharp knocks sounded at the front door. Sarah and Elaine froze, staring at each other. Through the curtains, they could see Delgado's patrol car outside, but no sign of the officer himself. The knocking repeated, still exactly 3 raps. Don't answer it, Elaine whispered. I wasn't planning to, Sarah replied. A voice came through the door, that same rustling paper sound. Ms. Winters, Ms. Caldwell, the census requires your participation. They remained silent, barely breathing. Your officer cannot help you, the voice continued conversationally. He's currently answering his own questions. Most truthfully, I might add. Sarah reached for her phone to call for backup, but the screen showed no signal. You lied to me yesterday, Ms. Winters, the voice said. Those who provide false information must be re-interviewed. It's policy. Something scratched at the window, long, thin fingers tapping against glass. Sarah glanced over and immediately wished she hadn't. A face was pressed against the pane, but it wasn't a face at all, just a suggestion of features in absolute darkness, like a hole cut in reality. 100 years, the voice said from the door. That was our arrangement with Edmund. He collects for us for 1 century, then returns, to gather a new harvest. So efficient, your government systems. So trusted. The perfect cover for our needs. What are you? Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Hungry, came the simple reply. Information carries energy, emotional, psychological, spiritual. Fears contain the most sustenance, dreams the most flavor, beliefs about death the most potential. Elaine grabbed Sarah's arm. Look, she whispered. Shadows were gathering in every corner of the room, deepening, taking shape. Vaguely humanoid figures emerged from darkness, watching with non-existent eyes. If you won't open the door, the voice said, my colleagues will keep you company until you're ready to answer truthfully. The shadows began moving closer, maintaining their form even as Sarah turned on every light in the room. They weren't cast by anything. They were independent entities, 3-dimensional darkness given shape. What do we do? Elaine whispered, backing against the wall. Sarah's mind raced. The journal had said those who answered truthfully died, while those who lied were haunted by shadows. Neither option seemed acceptable. Then she had an idea. You want to know my greatest fear? She called out. It's you. Right now, in this moment, you are my greatest fear. A pause from outside. Interesting. And your most frequent dream? I dream about this moment too. Being trapped, hunted by something inhuman. Every night now, this exact scenario. The shadows hesitated in their approach. And what happens after death? The voice asked, a new edge to its tone. You tell me, Sarah countered. You've caused enough of it. What happens to the energy you don't consume? Where does it go? A longer silence. The shadows retreated slightly. You're feeding it recursive information, Elaine whispered, catching on. A loop. Sarah nodded. These entities fed on human consciousness, fears, dreams, beliefs. By making the entities themselves the subject of that consciousness, she was creating a feedback loop. "My greatest fear is entities that feed on fears," she called out more confidently. "I dream about shadow beings that consume dreams. I believe death leads to becoming the kind of consciousness eater that you are." A high, thin sound came from outside like wind through dead trees. The shadows began to waver, their forms becoming less distinct. "You cannot trick us," the voice said, but it sounded uncertain. "The arrangement stands. 100 years. A new harvest." "The arrangement was with Edmund Thorne," Sarah said. "Not with us. We never agreed to be your food." "Edmund serves us still," the voice insisted. "He collects, we consume." "Then where is he?" Sarah demanded. "Let us see the man who made this deal." The shadows parted near the front door. Through the peephole, Sarah could now see the tall figure clearly in the porch light. But what she had taken for an old-fashioned suit was actually a census taker's uniform from 1923, now worn and faded. The clipboard was rotted, the papers yellow with age, and the face, what she had thought were shadowed eyes, were actually empty sockets in a desiccated, mummified head. Edmund Thorne, or what remained of him, preserved somehow for a century, but clearly not living, not human anymore. "Oh my God," Elaine breathed. "He made a poor bargain," Sarah called out. "Is that what happens? You keep his body as a puppet while feeding on his consciousness for eternity?" The shadows wavered more violently now. The thing that had been Edmund Thorne stood motionless on the porch. Sarah pressed her advantage. "I'm changing the terms. No more midnight questions, no more deaths, no more shadows. Return to wherever you came from and never come back to Millfield. You have no authority," the paper voice whispered, but it sounded weaker. "I speak for this town," Sarah said firmly. "We all refuse your census. We withdraw our consent to be counted, to be consumed." The shadows began to collapse in on themselves, becoming two-dimensional again, then fading entirely. Outside, the figure of Edmund Thorne remained, but something had changed. It seemed less animated, more like what it truly was, a century-old corpse. Sarah and Elaine watched in horrified fascination as the figure slowly toppled forward, hitting the porch with a dry, hollow sound. Through the peephole they could see it crumbling, decades of preserved decay finally catching up all at once. By morning, nothing remained on Sarah's porch but dust and fragments of rotted cloth. Officer Delgado was found unconscious in his patrol car, with no memory of midnight to dawn. The 4 who had died were buried with little explanation, their deaths officially attributed to natural causes. In the following days, Sarah and Elaine shared what they had learned with town officials. Most were skeptical, but enough believed, or at least worried, that precautions were taken. The town records were updated with a special notation about June 17th, with instructions for future generations. "Do you think it's really over?" Elaine asked a week later, as they sat on Sarah's porch in the afternoon sun. "Or will something else come in another 100 years?" Sarah looked at the spot where Edmund Thorne had collapsed. "I don't know, but at least the town will be prepared next time." That night, Sarah slept peacefully for the first time since the midnight knock. No shadows gathered in her corners, no figures watched from doorways. But as she drifted off, she couldn't help wondering about the nature of the bargain Edmund Thorne had made a century ago. Had he known what would happen? Had he sought immortality, only to become a puppet for entities that fed on human consciousness? Or had he been a true believer, convinced that these beings deserved the sustenance they sought? In her dreams, she saw Millfield from above, as she often did. But this time she noticed shadows moving through the streets, not threatening, just observing, waiting, hungry. 100 years was a long time to wait. But for entities that fed on consciousness, perhaps it was just the blink of an eye. The midnight census would come again. And next time, the questions might be different. Thanks for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed tonight's chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that keep you up at night. Share your favorite part in the comments. We're always watching, and remember, at Nocturnal Narrative Studio, the night never truly ends.